Ruth Halpern, all the way from California. This lady is tall, she's elegant, she is smooth, and she's got a story that she started telling me on the side, and I already started going like, ugh. Here she is. Hold on to your chair, Ruth Halpern.
The coast of California, south of Monterey, is even more rugged than the windward coast of Oahu. And that's the place where John Steinbeck made his home. Now, his son, Thomas, grew up knowing that the rule at the Steinbeck table is, you don't have a story, you don't eat. And when Thomas grew up, he had this collection of dining table stories that he published in a book called Down to the Shining Sea. And they don't read like book stories, they read like dinner table gossip. Now, once, long ago in China, there lived a wealthy boy, and he received all the proper upbringing of a member of the aristocracy. He learned how to shoot, he learned elegant calligraphy, he learned how to swim, and he learned that special art of holding himself deep inside, of knowing that he could control even the strongest feelings. But when he grew to be a young man and it was his time for his inheritance, the soldiers marched in from the north and they destroyed everything. His entire family was killed and he was thrown into slavery, digging ditches in China. It seemed his life was over. And he thought, now would be a time to become a ghost. But it turns out we cannot choose when the story's over. And one day, into his encampment came a man who was looking for strong workers to go to Gold Mountain, California. And this young man, Yongking, he thought to himself, I could die here or go somewhere new, and maybe a new door will open. So he accepted. He took ship and sailed to Gold Mountain knowing nothing, and certainly not knowing that he was moving from one slavery into another, because he and 100 other Chinese were marched straight off the boat up from the Sacramento Valley and into the gold country, where they worked from sunrise to sunset. In mines so small and narrow, they had to work on their bellies. And every night, in the bunkhouse, the seasoned hands, the older Chinese men, taught him how if you gather the powder from inside the mines and shake that powder into a glass full of kerosene, the gold will sink to the bottom and the dirt will float on the top. And if you dip a pine needle in pine sap, you can pick those golden flecks out of the kerosene, save them in your belt. And after 14 years of this, Yongking had 3 pounds of gold that he wore sewn into a belt that he slept in day and night. Now, one day, a big shipment had arrived down in the river valley, and they needed some people to unload it. So they took 50 of the workers out of the mine and took them down to the river's edge to unload a big cargo ship. And they were using an old-style boom that would lift things up out of the hold and then swing them to shore. And it was the job of these gold miners to receive those great bundles and haul them up onto the shore. But the boom, as it rose up, it broke loose and it swung through the crowd and it swept 20 people off the dock into the water. Most of them did not know how to swim. But Yongking, even weighed down by his heavy money belts, was able to swim under the dock and listen, and he realized that everyone thought they were all dead, and he was free. He waited till nightfall, he crawled up out of the river, and he followed the stream down to the outskirts of Sacramento, and he found Chinatown. And there, he traded some of his gold powder for clothes of an ordinary farm worker instead of a gold miner. And he received a handwritten map that showed him how to get somewhere where no one would find him, how to make his way down south to Salinas, where there was a Chinatown, with an herbal doctor who might be able to put him to work. Now, this young man had been raised in the great traditions of China, and he knew there was no place more dangerous than the wilderness at night. We know that too. We know the sounds and the shadows of the slipping creatures whose names we may not recognize, but their claws ring a bell. For 2 weeks, he walked in hunger and terror, through drenching rains, through clawing, tangled forests, through a kind of fear that we can only imagine. And with all of his will, he held tight to himself, and he said, I will arrive. When he finally got to Salinas, it was pouring rain. The streets were running with mud, and he made his way along the wooden walkways through Chinatown until he saw the symbol on the herbalist's door. And he knocked, and he fainted. And they had to pull him in off the doorstep, and the next thing he knew, he was lying on a comfortable mat on the floor, and an angel was tending him. He said, at last, I am a ghost. I'm free. But then that angel held a spoon under his nose, and the smells were earthy, and he realized he was alive. He sipped the soup, and gradually over the course of a week, he recovered some of his strength, enough to learn that this was no angel, but a young woman from a fishing village out at the coast who had been widowed when her husband was washed out to sea. And she was helping the herbal doctor because she was so good at gathering herbs that he had taught her a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and her healing was working. Young King became well enough to sit up. His angel came to visit less and less often. But one afternoon, he saw her by his bedside. She was holding a white cat on her lap, whom she introduced as the Duchess of Wu, her white cat, who went with her on her journey to the coast and back inland to Salinas. And the Duchess of Wu sniffed young King, and her whiskers quivered, and then she purred. This was an unusual mark of affection. And it marked the moment when young King realized the affection he had for the young woman. But what could he offer her? Other than his belt of gold, he had no skills, he had no trade, he had nothing. Until that evening, when the herbal doctor, his rescuer, said, I need an apprentice, and I have seen that you can read and write. Will you train with me and follow my trade? I could leave you my business, as I have no family. And the young man, who had longed only to be a ghost, felt himself more material, and he accepted. Well, they would go on long journeys by horse and wagon because there were people to be tended everywhere. They tended injured workers in the gold mines, fishermen down by the sea, and they went and visited the fishing village where the young woman lived. Young King prepared carefully and secreted in the wagon all kinds of gifts, the special betrothal gifts that he splurged on with his gold and powder. And when they arrived at her village, he saw how the wooden houses were perched up on stilts that leaned out over the ocean, balanced on the cliff like rickety little birds' nests. He met her father-in-law, who cared for her after her husband had died. And he laid his offerings, not before the feet of the young woman, but before the father-in-law, and stacked up the food and the baskets and the lovely china that he had picked himself. And that mountain was set up like a scale with the young woman in the balance. And the elders of the village came and weighed the two to make sure that it was a fair trade. Young King didn't care about that at all. All he wanted to know was if she would have him. Well, she went into the barn to turn that wooden wagon into his bed for the night. And when he went to climb into it, there on the pillow was a woven ring made out of the stems of wildflowers. And he knew that her heart was his. They spent 3 minutes alone together on that rickety porch overlooking the ocean in silence. There were so many things he wanted to tell her, and he could not say a word. And then the Duchess of Wu came and sat on his lap. And so the arrangement was sealed. He and the doctor went back to Salinas, and for the first time in his life, he let himself spend his treasure. He wanted to build a beautiful home for his new wife, for her father-in-law. He was going to have a garden. He was going to have a family. He was going to be a man on this earth. And as the preparations continued, he grew more and more impatient, and the apothecary, the herbalist, grew more and more disgusted. Here he thought he had found a hard-working young man to inherit his business, to inherit his healing trade, and instead, just another lovesick noodle brain. He said, "Wait, be patient." And though young King burned for his love, he followed his elder's advice. He delayed the wedding from early March till the end of April. And it was in the second week of April that an unseasonably late storm blew in, swept through the Salinas Valley, pounded the town, turned the roads to mud and then to rivers. No one could go anywhere. The young man had to stop his preparations and spend all of his time grinding and collecting and sorting the herbs until late one night, as the rain was driving down, they heard a hollow thumping at the door. And when they opened it, a man stepped in dripping, soaked, carrying a basket that seemed to be heavy. And as he stood making puddles on the floor of their little shop, his teeth were chattering in his head, his whole body was shaking, and his eyes were as wide as young King's were during that long journey. He said, "I do not want to tell, I do not want to tell, I do not want to tell." What? "I do not want to tell, I do not want to tell." And at that moment, the lid of the basket popped up, and out poked the nose of the Duchess of Wu. She jumped out of the basket and twined herself around young King's legs. And he knew. The shivering man said, the storm was so powerful, it destroyed the entire village. There's nothing left. We found her body on the cliffs. Now the doctor, the apothecary, the herbalist was a healer of long, long understanding. And he watched young King's face closely at this moment. Because sometimes when fate strikes a terrible blow, you can see the spirit flinch and rebound. But in that moment, in young King's face, the light went out. His spirit broke. And he swept the cat up under his arm, and he walked out the door. He never came back. But there were stories that he had made a home for himself, a little hut way up in the mountains. And every once in a while, an injured hunter or a traveler who'd lost his way would come home with a story of a man with flowing white hair and a long mustache who tended them in the forest, always attended by a snow-white cat.
Ruth Halpern and Elaine. Madame.